In every city there are stories that never made the papers. Stories too quiet, too careful, too patient to be caught by headlines. Buffalo, New York was one of those cities. On the edge of the Great Lakes, where the wind smells of snow and iron, a man arrived from Sicily with nothing but a black suit, a Bible, and a gift for silence, asterisk. They called him the Undertaker. For half a century he ruled without noise. No shouting, no show, no blood in the streets, only obedience, asterisk. His empire stretched across the river into Canada, through unions, docks, and funeral parlors. A kingdom built on whispers. Tonight, you'll hear the rise and quiet fall of the Buffalo crime family, a world where silence was currency, loyalty was law, and fear spoke softly. No bright lights, no gunfire, just the hum of history beneath the snow. So settle in. Let the city grow dark, let the river slow its pulse, and drift with me into the silent empire. The year was 1909. Buffalo, New York, sat under a sky of gray ash and steam, where the river froze in layers of glass and factory whistles echoed through the dawn. The streets were lined with brick tenements, wooden wagons, and the faint smell of coal drifting from chimneys. In the middle of that industrial hum, a young Sicilian immigrant stepped off a train from New York City, thin, solemn, and already carrying the weight of too many funerals. His name was Stefano Magaddino. To most, just another face among thousands who had crossed the Atlantic chasing the American dream. But to those who knew where he came from, Castellamare del Golfo, a fishing town in Sicily, his last name carried the quiet tremor of something older than any American city. A place where loyalty was thicker than blood, and silence was the only language that mattered. He had left Sicily in mourning. His brother, Pietro, had been gunned down in New York during one of the early underworld feuds among the Castellamarese. Stefano was 27 then, a man who already understood that power often came dressed in mourning clothes. He moved north to Buffalo, a city that promised distance from chaos, an opportunity for those who knew how to blend into its shadows. In those years, Buffalo was growing fast. Immigrants from Italy, Ireland, and Poland filled the neighborhoods west of downtown. The steel mills by the river worked day and night, trains rattled toward Chicago, and barges drifted between the Great Lakes and the Erie Canal. It was a place of motion, and of money. But to a Sicilian like Magaddino, it also offered something rarer, anonymity. A man could build a new life here and never draw attention to himself. He opened a small funeral home on Niagara Street. A quiet business, perfectly suited to his temperament. People came to him in their worst moments, when voices were low, when grief demanded privacy, when questions were not welcome. He treated them with respect, spoke gently, charged fairly. And soon he became known as the Undertaker. Not as a nickname of menace, but of demeanor. He dressed in black, moved slowly, and seemed to understand sorrow in a way that made people trust him. Trust, in those years, was a form of currency. Within a few blocks of his funeral home, small gambling parlors and import shops thrived, run by men who shared his accent, his food, his memories of the old country. They were remnants of the Castellamarese clan, Sicilians who had fled internal wars back home and were quietly rebuilding networks across America. In Buffalo, Magaddino became their anchor. The man who could keep things orderly, who spoke little but whose word carried weight. At night, when the city fell silent under the snow, Stefano would close the parlor doors, light a single lamp, and review his books. The names written there weren't only of the dead. They included men who owed favors, small businesses he quietly financed, and friends who had gone to work in local unions or city offices. The funeral home was more than a place of mourning, it was an office of quiet influence. He had learned long ago that control didn't require attention. It required patience. Buffalo was far from New York's volatile streets, far from the headlines about shootouts and mob wars. Here the game could be played differently. While others chased fame, Stefano built relationships, slowly, carefully, like a craftsman shaping marble. He offered loans to dock workers when the banks turned them away. He mediated disputes among the Italian grocers, making sure no one lost too much pride. And when tempers flared between rival crews from the east side, he was the one both sides trusted to calm it down. He had a gift for turning chaos into calm and calm into authority. Some nights, the police captain would pass by the funeral home and see the lights still on. He never questioned it. A man who worked with the dead deserved his privacy. That privacy would become Stefano's armor. By 1918, whispers had begun to travel from Buffalo to Rochester, and even down to New York City. They spoke of a Sicilian undertaker who never raised his voice, yet nothing happened in his part of the city without his consent. He didn't need soldiers, he had silence. And in the language of organized crime, silence was a fortress. Then came the Prohibition Act in 1920. Across America, alcohol was outlawed, and overnight, a black market worth millions was born. In border cities like Buffalo, that new law sounded less like a restriction and more like an invitation. For Stefano Magaddino, it would be the turning point. He saw what few others could, that the cold river flowing from Ontario wasn't just a line on a map, it was a corridor. A hidden artery between Canada's distilleries and America's thirst. And he knew how to move quietly across it. In the dark months that followed, trucks began rolling through Buffalo's side streets long after midnight. Some carried coffins. Others carried crates that looked like coffins. The Undertaker's business was thriving in more ways than one. But to the outside world, nothing had changed. The man in black still walked to work each morning. The funeral parlor still smelled faintly of flowers and formaldehyde. And the neighbors still said the same thing whenever his name came up. Mr. Magaddino? He's a decent man. Keeps to himself. Always quiet. They didn't know that silence could build an empire. Outside, snow drifted over the frozen river. The city slept under its white blanket, unaware that beneath it, a new order was taking root, one that would last for half a century. And at its center sat a man who understood better than anyone that the less you say, the more they fear you. The winter of 1920 arrived colder than anyone could remember. The Niagara River lay still under slabs of ice, its mist frozen into white veils that drifted over the bridges. Factories slowed, the docks fell quiet, and somewhere across the water, Canada kept producing the one thing Americans were no longer allowed to have: liquor. When the Prohibition Act took effect, the United States went dry on paper. But paper doesn't change thirst. Taverns shuttered, distilleries vanished underground, and within weeks, Buffalo's nightlife had turned into an open secret. Every basement, every barn, every quiet house on the outskirts of town began to hum with the sound of hidden stills. Men whispered about opportunity. The streets whispered about the Undertaker. For Stefano Magaddino, Prohibition wasn't a crisis, it was a calling. He saw, in that sudden silence of supply, the perfect market for a man who had built his life on discretion. Where others drew guns, he drew maps. Where others hired killers, he hired drivers. Across the river in Ontario, distilleries operated freely. Whiskey, gin, and rum filled warehouses waiting for someone bold enough to move them south. Buffalo was only 20 miles from that liquid gold. Magaddino didn't need armies to cross that line. He needed quiet men, steady men who knew how to follow orders and forget names. He found them among the dock workers, truck drivers, and fishermen who lived along the waterfront. Men who didn't ask questions if the pay came in envelopes and the instructions were clear. They ran small boats through the fog, hugging the current where the river's sound swallowed the noise of engines. Crates were loaded by lantern light, covered with tarps, and driven to storage houses disguised as funeral supply depots. The operation was elegant in its simplicity. Liquor came in coffins, literally. Wooden boxes marked mortuary goods passed through customs without inspection, destined for Magaddino funeral services. Officials looked away. No one wanted to open a coffin. He didn't just move whiskey, he moved trust. Each man along the route was chosen through family, through blood or marriage or old country loyalty. If one failed, they all failed. If one talked, they all vanished. The system relied not on fear, but on honor, a Sicilian code older than any American law. By 1923, Magaddino's route from Hamilton, Ontario, through Niagara Falls, and into Buffalo was the cleanest in the Northeast. Other mobs fought bloody wars in Chicago and New York, but here the operation ran with near-bureaucratic precision. No headlines, no bodies, just steady profit. The newspapers never printed his name. The police reports never used his address. That was his genius. He became known among his associates as the man who never raises his voice. If a problem arose, a stolen truck, a missing crate, he didn't shout. He simply called the families involved to the funeral parlor, where the scent of lilies reminded everyone of mortality. Disputes rarely repeated themselves. Every month, envelopes of cash were delivered to local union heads, city inspectors, and certain police officers who understood the value of keeping their ears closed. Even the Canadian side had its share of friendly customs men, content to earn extra for looking the other way. The money flowed like the river itself, silent, constant, impossible to trace. But Magaddino wasn't chasing wealth alone. He was building structure. In his mind, every driver was a soldier, every warehouse a fortress, every handshake a treaty. The Buffalo family wasn't yet recognized as a full Mafia family, but the shape was forming. The bootlegging years were his apprenticeship in empire. His connections to Joe Bonanno, another Castellamarese rising star in New York, grew stronger. The two men shared bloodlines, culture, and a philosophy: business first, noise never. While the New York families drew public attention through violence, Magaddino's approach remained invisible. He didn't need to make front pages. He preferred footnotes and police files. By 1928, the Undertaker's control extended beyond Buffalo. He had loyal men in Rochester, Niagara Falls, Hamilton, and even Detroit, where the Purple Gang ruled the docks with brutal efficiency. But where Detroit saw chaos, Buffalo saw calm. Magaddino's empire worked like an underground railway: routes, signals, passwords, schedules, all synchronized by silence. There were nights when he stood alone by the riverbank, coat collar turned up against the wind, watching lanterns drift across the mist. The smugglers would return before dawn, frost on their hair, and nod silently as they unloaded crates into waiting hearses. No words exchanged. No paper trail. Just an empire of ghosts. Rumors began to spread through law enforcement circles. Who runs Buffalo? The answer was always the same shrug. No one really. It's quiet up there. Quiet, yes. But that quiet was worth millions. With the profits from bootlegging, Magaddino expanded his legitimate holdings: real estate, construction, distribution companies. He bought influence in Local 210, the powerful labor union that handled construction and transport contracts throughout western New York. That foothold would later become the backbone of his entire reign. By the time Prohibition neared its end in 1933, Buffalo had changed. The bars reopened. The whiskey ran legally again. But for men like Magaddino, the underground had already proven its worth. The pipelines built for liquor would now carry new products: gambling, narcotics, protection money. The infrastructure was eternal, only the cargo changed. And through it all, the Undertaker never broke his rhythm. He still attended church on Sundays. Still walked home with hands clasped behind his back. Still greeted neighbors with a nod and a small, unreadable smile. To them, he was just the quiet man with the funeral business who somehow always seemed busy, even when the streets were empty. They didn't know that the river beside them had carried more than water. It had carried his fortune, his power, and his legend. The noise of the roaring 20s faded. By the early 1930s, America was tired. The Great Depression had hollowed cities and silenced factories. Men who once hauled barrels of bootleg whiskey now stood in breadlines, hats in hand, eyes on the pavement. But while fortunes vanished overnight, the Undertaker's business stayed steady. People always needed someone to bury the past. Stefano Magaddino watched the chaos from behind the curtains of his funeral home. Others panicked, he planned. He saw in the collapse of the economy a strange opportunity, a vacuum of authority that quiet men could fill while loud men fought for survival. Buffalo, perched between the industrial Midwest and the eastern seaboard, became a crossroads again. Only this time it wasn't for whiskey, it was for power. When the Castellamarese War erupted downstate between Joe Masuria and Salvatore Maranzano, Magaddino didn't take sides openly. He had ties to Maranzano through the Sicilian bloodline they shared. But Buffalo was far from New York City. The gunfire never reached his streets. Instead, he waited, as he always did, for the storm to pass. In 1931, when Maranzano was killed and Lucky Luciano reorganized the underworld into the modern Mafia Commission, the Buffalo boss received quiet recognition. Stefano Magaddino was officially acknowledged as the head of the Western New York family, an autonomous territory under the commission structure. No fanfare. No ceremony. Just a handshake in a back room and a nod that meant, "You are one of us." From that moment, his reign began in earnest. He expanded control over the Niagara corridor, bridging Buffalo with Rochester, Utica, Hamilton, and even reaching into the outskirts of Toronto. His men operated the border like a business, moving goods, money, and people between nations as if customs didn't exist. And while others like Luciano and Costello appeared in the papers, Magaddino preferred to disappear in plain sight. He attended church every Sunday, smiled for parish photos, hosted neighborhood picnics. His public life was so unremarkable that the police nearly forgot to watch him. That was by design. The man was building what agents would later call the silent empire. At its core was Local 210, the construction and transport union that handled nearly every major project in western New York. Magaddino quietly placed his trusted men in key positions: union treasurers, dispatch managers, shop stewards. Contracts began to flow toward companies he owned through relatives or friends. If a rival company tried to bid lower, trucks mysteriously failed to arrive, or cement hardened before it poured. No threats, no witnesses, no trace. Just the invisible weight of approval, or its absence. He also controlled garbage disposal, trucking, and import-export warehouses, the unglamorous arteries of a city's daily life. It was a subtle kind of dominance. If you wanted anything to move through Buffalo, from bricks to sugar to fish, you eventually passed through Magaddino's shadow. His nickname, the Undertaker, became more symbolic than literal. He buried not just people but problems. When disputes arose among smaller crews, they came to him like sinners to confession. He'd sit in his office behind the funeral parlor, hands folded, listening quietly while the air smelled faintly of lilies. When they finished talking, he'd say little. Usually just one sentence, calm, slow, final. And that was enough. The matter ended there. He ruled through what one FBI report would later call the authority of absence. He didn't need to show force. His absence was force. Under his watch, Buffalo thrived in the shadows. Gambling houses operated out of cafes and barber shops. Bookmakers used funeral vans to collect bets. The docks handled crates marked as machine parts, which often contained European morphine headed to New York. Still, the city remained oddly peaceful. The murder rate was lower than other industrial towns of similar size. The papers occasionally mentioned corruption but never named names. It was as if the silence itself kept everything orderly. He had a saying shared only with his closest men. Noise brings eyes. Eyes bring death. We build in silence, we stay alive. His influence stretched beyond crime. Local politicians accepted campaign donations from community figures connected to his network. Catholic charities received envelopes stuffed with anonymous bills. Priests gave blessings at his family dinners. Everyone benefited from his stability and learned not to ask how it was maintained. By the mid-1940s, Magaddino had become one of the most respected and least known Mafia bosses in the country. When the FBI finally began assembling its lists of major organized crime figures, his name was there but barely highlighted. A note scribbled by an agent in 1946 read, "Buffalo believed quiet. Possibly controlled by one S. Magaddino, funeral director. No confirmed criminal record." That, to Stefano, was the greatest compliment imaginable. The post-war years brought prosperity and with it, new ambitions. Returning soldiers needed homes. Roads, bridges, and factories rose across western New York. Every contract passed through Local 210. Every truck was touched by his people. Buffalo became his machine, a silent, efficient organism that answered to no one but him. At home, he lived modestly. A two-story house, a Buick in the driveway, Sunday dinners with family. He didn't wear flashy suits or rings like other bosses. His suits were black, his shoes polished, his eyes sharp and unreadable. The only extravagance was his habit of sending fresh flowers every week to the graves of old friends and old enemies. The world around him grew louder. New York City exploded with gangland violence. Chicago made headlines weekly. Las Vegas began glittering with mob money. But Buffalo remained invisible. To outsiders, it was just a cold industrial city on the Great Lakes. To insiders, it was one of the most profitable territories in America. And at its center, still running the show from his funeral home, was a man who believed that true power didn't come from fear or fame. It came from patience and silence. The Undertaker had become something larger than a boss. He was an institution. A man whose voice could calm a room, or end it, without ever being raised. Outside, the wind from the lake howled through the alleys of Buffalo. Snow gathered on empty streets. And somewhere, behind drawn curtains and drawn-out prayers, envelopes exchanged hands, deals were sealed with nods, and history moved, quietly, under his name. By the mid-1940s, Buffalo no longer looked like the gray industrial town Magaddino had first arrived in. Factories along the river smoked day and night, the docks glimmered with cargo ships, and new neighborhoods spread outward with post-war optimism. Soldiers returned home, building houses, families, and dreams. But underneath that hum of progress, another kind of order pulsed, one that didn't appear in newspapers but could be felt in every deal, every truck route, every paycheck. It was Magaddino's order. From his modest office behind the funeral parlor on Niagara Street, the Undertaker ran a network so efficient that even the city's own officials couldn't tell where legality ended and loyalty began. His reach extended through Local 210, the construction and transport union that had quietly become the backbone of his empire. If you wanted concrete poured, steel delivered, or workers on site, you went through Local 210, and Local 210 went through him. Contracts were more than paperwork. They were lines of allegiance. A handshake wasn't just agreement, it was a pledge to remain quiet. The men who sat in union meetings during the day often visited Magaddino's parlor at night, not for funerals but for advice. They came through the back door, past the cool scent of carnations and candles, into the small office lined with ledgers. There, under the dim glow of a desk lamp, Stefano would listen. He rarely interrupted. When he finally spoke, his words came measured, deliberate, heavy. And once he had spoken, the discussion was over. He talked like a priest, one former associate later said. But when he stopped talking, you knew something, or someone, was finished. The city's construction boom was his opportunity. New factories, bridges, and housing projects needed labor, materials, and trucking. Magaddino positioned his people to control every link in the chain. His nephews oversaw transportation companies, trusted lieutenants managed supply warehouses. Even the suppliers of cement and gravel found it simpler, and safer, to do business through intermediaries he controlled. Kickbacks flowed smoothly, wrapped in envelopes marked as consulting fees. Union leaders received bonuses for signing preferred contracts. Inspectors found their mortgages mysteriously paid off. It wasn't greed. It was gravity. Everything, and everyone, eventually fell toward the Undertaker. Occasionally, someone resisted. A contractor from Rochester who refused to pay the union adjustment. A young driver who bragged to police about knowing where the money went. In Buffalo, those stories ended quietly. No headlines, no drama, just disappearances that blended into the city's nightly fog. The river was deep. The quarries were silent. The earth under new construction sites hid more than foundations. But Stefano never raised his voice, never gave an order in anger. He spoke softly even when he spoke of death. To him, violence wasn't spectacle. It was procedure. The way a surgeon handles infection. Necessary, clinical, regrettable. People feared him, yes. But more than that, they respected him. He was predictable in his calm. Rational. Almost fatherly. In a world of impulsive gangsters and loud bosses, Magaddino was steady. He kept books balanced, tempers low, and profits high. Even law enforcement found itself lulled by that stability. The Buffalo police received few complaints from the Italian districts. There were no gang wars, no bloody headlines. To the outside eye, the city seemed peaceful, even disciplined. FBI field reports in 1946 described Buffalo as organized but quiet, lacking significant open criminal activity. They didn't realize that the quiet was the crime. Stefano's home mirrored his demeanor. Simple furniture, a cross above the mantel, family photos on the wall. His wife, Carmela, tended the garden and cooked for Sunday dinners that brought together relatives and close associates. The meals were loud with laughter and Sicilian songs, but even there, hierarchy never vanished. No one spoke over Stefano. When he lifted his glass, the table fell silent. When he nodded, they drank. In those gatherings, he passed lessons that would outlive him, rules that would later define the Buffalo family. Stay small. Stay unseen. Never forget where you came from. Meanwhile, the world beyond Buffalo was shifting. Lucky Luciano had been deported. Vito Genovese and Carlo Gambino were tightening their grip on New York. Chicago's outfit was pouring money into Las Vegas. And the American Mafia, Cosa Nostra, was becoming a corporate machine. Magaddino watched from the sidelines, content to remain the invisible shareholder of it all. He didn't need bright lights or casinos. He had unions, trucks, and silence, and they were far more reliable. Yet, power carries weight even when it's quiet. By the late 1940s, tension began to hum beneath the surface. Younger men, ambitious lieutenants, wanted faster money, flashier ventures. They admired the style of New York bosses, the cars, the suits, the swagger. Stefano saw danger in that hunger. Noise, he warned, invites attention. Attention kills. But not everyone listened. Behind closed doors, small cracks began to form. Disputes over territories, over money, over respect. Still, for the public, the empire looked untouchable. Construction cranes swung over new highways, the docks hummed with activity, and the Undertaker's funeral home continued to operate as if nothing had changed. He had achieved what most mob bosses could only dream of. Power without exposure. Profit without bloodshed. Fear without noise. And yet, somewhere deep down, Stefano knew, silence could not last forever. Power breeds envy, and envy breeds betrayal. He had seen it before in Sicily, in New York, in every story that ended with gunfire and flowers. But for now, the streets of Buffalo stayed calm. The night wind off the lake carried only the sound of trains and distant foghorns. The city slept, wrapped in the quiet confidence of its unseen ruler. And in the dim back office of a funeral home, A man in black counted his ledgers, crossed out a few names, and whispered to himself, softly, almost kindly, "Everything is in order." By the end of the 1940s, Buffalo had become a quiet capital of the unseen. On the surface, it was still a blue-collar city, steel, grain, shipping, and snow. But behind that facade, the Undertaker's reach was stretching outward, following the same currents that once carried whiskey through the fog of Prohibition. The border was not a line to Stefano Magaddino. It was a seam, something to be stitched together, quietly, permanently. Across the Niagara River lay Ontario, still humming with distilleries, ports, and railroads. Italian families had settled there too, men who remembered the old country, who trusted the word of a Castellamarese above any written contract. Magaddino began sending emissaries across that frozen water. Drivers, freight clerks, and cousins who could blend into the warehouses of Hamilton, Toronto, and St. Catharines. Their task was simple: reconnect the arteries of his old bootlegging routes. Only now the cargo had changed. Whiskey had gone legal, but demand for heroin and morphine derivatives was quietly rising. Veterans back from war carried wounds medicine couldn't ease, and city streets were filling with new addictions. The French connection in Marseille supplied the product. Magaddino supplied the corridor. Through his Canadian contacts, the Papalia family in Hamilton and the Lupino brothers in Toronto, he established what FBI memos decades later would call the most disciplined cross-border trafficking network in North America. No violence, no scandals, just movement. Pharmaceutical crates mislabeled as cosmetics, funeral vans with embalming supplies, fishing boats that crossed the river at night under fog. Every border needs guards, and every guard needs comfort. Customs officers on both sides found small envelopes in their coat pockets, polite gifts for looking the other way. Sometimes it was cash. Sometimes a simple favor, a cousin's job, a debt forgiven. Stefano believed in paying everyone because a paid man stays predictable. His funeral parlor remained the headquarters, still smelling faintly of wax and lilies. The phones there never rang loudly, one short buzz was enough. A cousin on the Canadian side would say, "The shipment's on schedule." That was all. No names, no numbers, no product discussed. Silence had evolved into code. By 1950, the Buffalo, Ontario route was moving more than contraband. It moved influence, labor organizers, political donations, business fronts. A shipping company in Hamilton, a trucking firm in Buffalo, and a Catholic charity in Niagara Falls all appeared unrelated, yet their ledgers balanced like parts of the same equation. The Undertaker didn't need ownership papers. He owned the silence that bound them. Occasionally, outsiders tried to muscle in, Detroit crews, independent smugglers. They quickly learned that Buffalo wasn't Detroit. Here, problems didn't end with explosions. They ended with funerals. And those funerals always looked natural. The FBI's Buffalo field office started noticing patterns. Funeral homes with unusually high shipping costs, trucks crossing the Peace Bridge at odd hours. But every time they investigated, paperwork checked out. Licenses were valid. Taxes were paid. The books were immaculate. An internal memo from 1952 reads, "Subject: Magaddino Stefano operates legitimate mortuary. Possible ties to labor racketeering. No actionable evidence. Known for discretion." Discretion, that word again. It was the essence of his empire. On the Canadian side, Johnny Papalia, a young enforcer in Hamilton, began rising under Magaddino's mentorship. To outsiders, he was just a businessman importing olives and wine. To insiders, he was the Undertaker's right hand north of the border. Their bond bridged two nations, two economies, and countless secrets. The river itself seemed to serve him. Each night it whispered beneath the bridges, carrying freight and fog in equal measure. Fishermen swore they saw lanterns moving midstream where no boat should be. Sometimes the lights disappeared halfway across, swallowed by mist. Locals told stories about the ghost barges of Niagara. They weren't wrong. Those barges were his. While New York and Chicago splashed headlines of gangland killings, Buffalo remained serene. No public feuds, no open wars. Just a rhythm, the steady exchange of goods, cash, and silence. Even among Mafia circles, Magaddino was a mystery. When bosses met in New York, they spoke loudly, bragged about profits. Stefano listened, eyes half closed, hands folded on the table. He rarely drank, rarely smiled. Yet when the meeting ended, it was his quiet nod that settled disputes. By the mid-1950s, he was considered one of the old-world patriarchs of Cosa Nostra. Wise, patient, and dangerous precisely because he never seemed angry. You couldn't read him, and that terrified people more than a gun. His power now reached from Buffalo to Montreal, touching ports, warehouses, trucking unions, and customs offices. And yet, the city he ruled barely noticed. The papers still called him a respectable funeral director. Neighbors still waved when he drove by in his black Buick. Children in the neighborhood even called him Uncle Stefano. But every so often, when a businessman suddenly left town, or a warehouse burned mysteriously after an audit, people whispered. And when they whispered, they lowered their voices, out of habit or maybe out of instinct. Because in Buffalo, whispers had ears. By 1956, Magaddino's empire was entering its golden age. The network was complete. Legitimate fronts, loyal men, and a border that obeyed him more faithfully than it obeyed either government. But history, like the river, never stays still. A year later, a quiet meeting in the countryside of New York would change everything. For the first time in decades, silence would fail him. The world would learn his name. Autumn 1957. Upstate New York. The leaves had turned copper and gold, and the air smelled faintly of rain and wood smoke. For most Americans, it was just another quiet season in the countryside, hunters in the woods, families preparing for Thanksgiving. But for the Mafia, it was the season of gathering. A private estate near the small town of Appalachian sat at the edge of rolling hills, surrounded by pine trees and gravel roads. It belonged to Joseph Barbara, a soft-spoken beverage distributor, and, less openly, a trusted figure in the underworld. His property would soon host one of the largest meetings in organized crime history. The invitations went out quietly. From New York to Chicago, Cleveland to Los Angeles, and even Havana, bosses were told to attend. To discuss business, to discuss peace, to discuss money. And among those invited was Stefano Magaddino, the silent patriarch of Buffalo. He had attended such gatherings before, small, discreet, untraceable. But this one was different. There were too many men, too many cars, too much confidence. It was noisy before it even began. Still, Stefano agreed to go. He saw it as duty, as respect. The old world bosses had to show face, even if they preferred to remain unseen. It was the morning of November 14, 1957, when the cars began arriving at Barbara's estate. Cadillacs, Lincolns, Buicks, sleek, polished, and very out of place on a rural road. Inside them sat men whose names had never appeared in print, but whose shadows stretched across the country. Vito Genovese, Joseph Prophesy, Carlo Gambino, Joe Bonanno, Tony Accardo, and dozens more. And somewhere among them, quietly stepping out of a dark sedan, was the Undertaker of Buffalo. He wore a black overcoat, hat low, expression unreadable. The others greeted him with deference. Some kissed his cheek, others shook his hand. To them, he was the old guard, the Sicilian elder who had survived wars most of them only read about. They called it a convention. There would be lunch, discussion, and plans for a national strategy. Business, plain and simple. But not far down the road, a state trooper named Edgar Croswell had noticed something odd. Too many luxury cars, too many out-of-state plates, too many men in fine suits stepping onto a rural driveway. He began taking notes, then license numbers, then backup. As the meeting began inside, a patrol car pulled up outside. Then another, and another. The troopers watched as attendants carried trays of food into the house. Cold cuts, wine, cigars. They radioed for reinforcements. Within minutes, what was supposed to be a routine countryside meeting had turned into a trap. Inside, word spread quickly, police outside. The house erupted in panic. Dozens of men bolted for the doors, running through the backyard, diving over fences, scattering into the woods like startled deer. Shoes slipped in the mud, suits tore on thorns. The scene looked nothing like the legends these men would later become. Carlo Gambino hid behind bushes. Vito Genovese sprinted down a hill. And the Undertaker, old, dignified, furious, walked calmly toward his car, only to be stopped at the end of the driveway by two troopers with raised hands. Name? One officer asked. He gave it. Stefano Magaddino. Buffalo. The trooper wrote it down. He didn't know it then, but that one name would echo through Washington within weeks. The arrests weren't formal at first, just questioning, detainment, confusion. No one wanted to say who they were or why they were there. The newspapers got wind of it before the FBI did. Headlines blared across the country. Mafia convention raided in New York. 60 crime bosses detained in farmhouse meeting. For decades, the government had denied the existence of a national crime syndicate. Now, overnight, it was undeniable. The photographs showed rows of luxury cars, a field full of men in suits covering their faces, and lists of names that read like a directory of the American underworld. And among them, At the very top of one of those lists was Stefano Magaddino, funeral director, Buffalo, New York. The silence he had built around himself cracked open in a single day. His name, once confined to whispers, was now printed in black ink from coast to coast. Reporters camped outside his funeral home. FBI agents began wiretapping phones, tracing union ledgers, interviewing long-forgotten neighbors. His empire, once invisible, now had light shining directly on it. In Buffalo, people couldn't believe it. "Mr. Magaddino?" they said. "The man with the funeral home? Always so polite." It was as if the city had discovered its own reflection in the dark. Within weeks, FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, who had long dismissed talk of an organized mafia, was forced to admit otherwise. Before Congress, he acknowledged that a criminal organization of national scope did, in fact, exist. The word Cosa Nostra entered the American vocabulary, and the quiet man from Buffalo had helped make it impossible to deny. But the Undertaker didn't panic. He didn't flee or lash out. He returned to Buffalo, to his office, and resumed his routine. The same black suit, the same polished shoes. Only now, when he walked the streets, people looked longer, whispered softer. He told his men, "Let them talk. They forget faster than they read." Yet something had shifted. He could feel it, the weight of scrutiny, the strain of exposure. For the first time in decades, the silence no longer protected him. It trapped him. In private, Magaddino seethed. He blamed the younger bosses, the careless ones who turned business into spectacle. He blamed greed, pride, and stupidity. To him, Appalachian was not just a police raid, it was a betrayal of the old ways. The Sicilian code of discretion, broken by men who had forgotten that quiet was the only armor that ever truly worked. He withdrew further into isolation. Meetings became smaller, held only with family. The phone lines stayed cold. He began to trust fewer people and suspect everyone. In that winter of 1957, Buffalo's snow fell heavier than usual. The river froze solid, muffling even the sound of water. And somewhere inside his dimly lit parlor, the Undertaker sat at his desk, a newspaper folded before him, his own name under the headline. He stared at it for a long time, then turned off the light. Outside, the silence returned, but it was no longer his. It belonged to the watchers in the dark, the agents in parked cars, the whispers of a world that had finally learned to pronounce his name. Winter settled over Buffalo like a blanket of ash. After the raid at Appalachian, the entire underworld had changed. Names once hidden in whispers now filled FBI folders, and agents who had never heard of Cosa Nostra suddenly learned to pronounce every syllable. For the first time in his life, Stefano Magaddino had become visible, and that, to him, was far more dangerous than any bullet. He came back to Buffalo in early December 1957. The streets were gray, the river frozen, and the newspapers still printing his name. Neighbors greeted him nervously, unsure whether to smile or pretend they hadn't seen him. Even his friends in the clergy kept their distance. The church disliked scandal, and the Undertaker now carried it like a shadow. Inside his funeral home, nothing had changed. The lilies still perfumed the air. The same black phone sat on the desk. The same crucifix hung above the calendar. But the stillness no longer felt like control, it felt like surveillance. He knew there were ears in the walls now, lines tapped, letters opened. His empire had become a glass house. FBI agents began trailing his cars, tapping his phones, questioning anyone who had ever shaken his hand. Union leaders were subpoenaed, truckers interrogated, ledgers seized. They wanted to prove that Local 210, the backbone of Buffalo's construction world, was not a union at all, but a syndicate. To the agents, it was crime. To Stefano, it was order. He had given the city decades of peace and prosperity. Now those same streets turned their eyes away. He adjusted the only way he knew how. He withdrew deeper into silence. Meetings were held rarely, and always inside the parlor after dark, the blinds drawn. He spoke less. He trusted fewer people. His circle shrank to family. His son Peter, his nephew Vincent Scrow, and a handful of old Sicilian loyalists. Even among them, caution had become paranoia. He sensed ambition in their questions, restlessness in their tone. The world outside was changing. Younger men wanted faster money, newer schemes. To them, the old ways felt slow, outdated. But to Stefano, they were sacred. He reminded them softly. A loud man dies twice. Once in sound, once in silence. They nodded, but he could see it in their eyes. Youth doesn't believe in caution until it's too late. The FBI kept digging. In 1959, they froze several of Magaddino's business accounts, citing tax irregularities. Agents raided warehouses, union offices, even one of his legitimate trucking companies. No major arrests followed, but each raid chipped away at the aura of invincibility that had surrounded him. For the first time, people whispered that perhaps the Undertaker's time was fading. Across the river, the Canadian allies still respected him. The Papalia and Lupino families in Hamilton and Toronto stayed loyal, but even they grew nervous. The Americans had turned ruthless in their pursuit of Mafia figures, and cross-border cooperation became dangerous. Phone calls went unanswered. Meetings were delayed indefinitely. The great network that had once moved like clockwork now sputtered like a dying machine. In the summer of 1960, an event unsettled him more deeply than any raid. Joseph Barbara, the man whose estate had hosted the Appalachian meeting, died suddenly of a heart attack. To the public it was a small headline. To Stefano it was an omen. The generation of quiet men, the old Sicilians who had believed in discretion and patience, was vanishing, replaced by louder, hungrier successors. He felt the shift like a cold wind through a half-open door. Within his own family the cracks widened. His nephew Vincent began pressing for more control, arguing that Buffalo should modernize, move into narcotics, gambling, Las Vegas investments. Stefano refused. Noise, he said, kills faster than bullets. But the refusal only bred resentment. That resentment found ears. In 1962, the FBI intercepted several conversations suggesting that some of Magaddino's younger associates had begun cooperating quietly with investigators. Nothing concrete, just fragments, half-truths, whispers. But to a man who had built his empire on silence, even whispers felt like betrayal. He became more reclusive than ever. Meetings were held one-on-one with no notes, no witnesses. He dismissed drivers he'd known for 20 years. The empire still functioned, but its pulse had slowed, like a heartbeat under sedation. One evening, sitting alone in his dimly lit office, he told a confidant, "They think I fear the law. I fear memory more. A man can outlive a trial, but not a story." He was right. The legend of Appalachian still haunted him. Every new article, every Senate hearing, every police report used the same photo. His face, blurred behind a hat brim, walking toward a police car in the rain. That single image became the symbol of exposure. And the man who had built his life on invisibility now lived in the shadow of recognition. By the mid-1960s, Buffalo's economy was changing. Factories began closing, the docks slowed, young families moved south for work. The city that had once been the heart of his empire was fading, just like him. Yet he clung to routine: morning mass, black coffee, a slow drive through the same streets he had ruled in silence. Every turn was memory, every corner, a ghost. FBI cars followed at a distance, always there, always quiet. He ignored them. He had learned that even being hunted could become part of the ritual of control. If they wanted to watch him, he would give them nothing to see. Still, in the nights when the snow fell heavy and the phone stayed silent, he felt it, the loneliness of a man who had outlived his own power. His silence, once his fortress, had become his prison. Every ally now a suspect, every word a potential echo that might return to him twisted. He would tell himself that all empires end, but he had hoped his would end quietly, unseen. And deep down, he feared the truth that no Undertaker wants to admit. Even silence can die. By the late 1960s, Buffalo had grown quieter than ever, and not in the way Stefano Magaddino liked. The city was shrinking, its factories rusting, its workers moving away. The streets that had once thrummed with the sound of commerce now carried only the echo of trains departing for somewhere else. Inside his funeral home office, the Undertaker sat at his desk each morning, reading ledgers that no longer balanced and names that no longer answered. Time was changing faster than he could hide from it, and the danger no longer came from outside, it came from his own blood. His nephew Vincent Scrow had grown ambitious. Educated, younger, restless, Vincent believed the old man was stuck in a world that no longer existed. He wanted expansion, new money from Las Vegas, narcotics, loan sharking on a modern scale. He saw Buffalo as too small, too quiet, too slow. Stefano's own son, Peter Magaddino, stood between them, torn between filial duty and pragmatism. He respected his father's legacy but knew that times had shifted. The FBI was everywhere, and the money from construction and unions was drying up. "Father," he once said gently, "the world is louder now. We can't stay mute forever." Stefano looked at him for a long time and replied, "Silence never goes out of style. Noise only changes pitch." But the words didn't land. The young men were done listening. By 1968, tension was thick as the Niagara fog. Whispers circulated through the union halls. Somebody was talking to the FBI. A few arrests followed, Truck bosses, bookkeepers, men who had once been untouchable. Files appeared on desks that should never have existed. Stefano could feel the leaks but not find them. It was like being haunted by a ghost with his own last name. Then came the final insult, the money. For decades, Magaddino had controlled the family's finances personally. Every profit from gambling, loans, and unions passed through his hands before being redistributed. He kept it simple. What arrived at the top was cleaned, counted, and sent back down with blessings. But by 1969, the younger men wanted transparency, a word that made him laugh coldly. Transparency, he said, is a coffin with glass walls. Pretty, but you can't breathe inside it. Still, the grumbling continued. They wanted their share now, not after Mass and a week of accounting. Peter and Vincent decided to act. In the summer of 1969, as the city baked under thick air, the FBI raided Stefano's home. Agents kicked open doors, searched drawers, and walked out carrying boxes of cash and ledgers. Inside one locked cabinet they found over $400,000 in cash, meticulously wrapped in rubber bands and buried beneath church records. When reporters asked where the money came from, Stefano gave the same answer every time. From my savings. I am an old man. I do not trust banks. It sounded almost plausible, until his own family spoke. Behind his back, Vincent and Peter had leaked information to the authorities. They hoped to prove he was hoarding family profits, using law enforcement to force a reorganization. They didn't expect the news to explode nationwide. Headlines read, "Mafia leader caught with $400,000 in cash." The image of the Undertaker, once a symbol of control, became a caricature of greed. Within days, the Buffalo family was in chaos. Old loyalists refused orders, new men took sides, and lawyers circulated like vultures. Stefano stayed silent through it all. No public statements. No retaliation. He sat in his office, the light of a single lamp reflecting off his glasses, and listened as the walls of his own making echoed with betrayal. "Family," he murmured one night, "is the first business that kills its owner." The FBI pressed charges but couldn't make them stick. Years of discipline and caution had left no trail they could follow. Still, the damage was done. The family split into factions, half loyal to the old boss, half to his nephew and son. Meetings turned into arguments. Arguments turned into threats. For the first time in half a century, Buffalo felt what every other mafia city had long known: war within. Yet even as his empire burned quietly, Magaddino refused to raise his voice. He visited church more often, lit candles for those who had betrayed him. To outsiders, he looked like a tired old man clinging to routine. Inside, he was preparing for the only thing he had ever trusted to end all feuds: time. Time would bury them all: sons, nephews, agents, enemies. He didn't need revenge. He just needed to outlive them. And in that, he almost succeeded. By the end of the decade, the Buffalo family was a shadow of its former self. Business slowed. Allies fled. Silence, once his weapon, had become his isolation. The city that once whispered his name now barely remembered it. He was still the Undertaker, but this time the body he was burying was his own empire. Outside, snow fell quietly on Niagara Street, covering the tracks of all those who had come and gone. In his office, Stefano closed the ledger for the night, placed his hand on its cover, and whispered a prayer in Sicilian, for the dead, for the living, and for the things in between. The room smelled of wax and old paper. The clock ticked once, then twice. And somewhere in the distance, a train horn echoed through the snow. The decade turned. The 1970s came to Buffalo not with celebration, but with snow, endless, heavy, suffocating snow. Factories shut their doors one by one. The once busy docks of the Niagara grew still. And somewhere behind a fogged window on Niagara Street, the man who had once ruled it all sat watching the flakes drift past, dissolving against the glass. Stefano Magaddino was in his 80s now. His shoulders stooped, his hands trembled slightly as he poured his morning coffee. The black suits that once fit him perfectly now hung loose, his skin pale as candle wax. But his eyes, sharp, narrow, patient, still belonged to the Undertaker. He had outlived nearly everyone. The gang wars, the young bosses, the rivals in New York, all gone. Some died by bullets, others in prison cells, a few by the slow hand of age. He, the quiet one, had survived them all. But survival had stopped feeling like victory. The Buffalo crime family was a ghost of its former self. What had once been an intricate machine, unions, trucking, gambling, Canada routes, was now just fragments. The FBI had squeezed every corner of the organization. Some men had flipped. Others fled. The rest simply faded away. He no longer gave orders, there were few left to command. He spent his mornings reading newspapers, circling names of the dead. He recognized most of them, old friends, old enemies, sometimes both. Each headline was another nail in the coffin of the world he had built. Visitors still came occasionally, nephews, distant associates, even a priest. They spoke softly, bringing groceries or small gifts, pretending the old man was just a retired businessman. He would nod, thank them, and ask for nothing. In the evenings, when they were gone, he would light a single candle on his desk, the same desk he'd used for half a century, and sit for hours in silence. Sometimes he prayed. Sometimes he just listened to the house breathe. He had become a relic, a living museum of the old Mafia, from an age before cars with tinted glass and phones that could record. To the new generation of criminals, he was a myth. To law enforcement, he was a file that no longer mattered. But to Buffalo's older families, he was still a presence, like the sound of church bells or the chill of the river wind, always there, always watching. He rarely left his home. When he did, he drove slowly through the neighborhoods that had once been his kingdom. The funeral home still stood, though new owners ran it now. The sign had been repainted, the curtains changed. No one there knew that the walls once heard deals whispered in Sicilian, that behind the embalming tables money had changed hands that shaped the fate of cities. He parked across the street once, sat in his car and stared at it. For a long time. Then he smiled faintly and said, half to himself, "Even silence can be sold." In 1972, federal prosecutors tried again to build a case against him. Old tax charges, whispers of extortion, union corruption. But he was too old, too careful, too far removed. Witnesses died, memories blurred, files were lost. It was as if time itself refused to testify against him. He spent his last years in a small house north of the city, near Lewiston, close enough to hear the faint roar of Niagara Falls on still nights. He would sit on the porch in summer, wrapped in a blanket even when it was warm, watching mist rise from the river. Sometimes the sound reminded him of whispers, the kind that used to fill his phone lines long ago. Now only the wind carried them. He had always believed that silence was power. Now he learned its final lesson, that silence, when stretched too long, becomes loneliness. His wife, Carmela, passed first. After that, he spoke even less. The house grew colder, quieter. A few loyal relatives came by weekly to bring food, to check on him. They found him sitting by the radio, listening not to music but to static. He said the noise reminded him that he was still here. The last time anyone saw him outside, it was winter again, 1973. He was walking slowly down the sidewalk, hat low, coat buttoned against the wind. To most, he looked like any old man heading to mass. But to those who remembered, it was a ghost walking through the ruins of his own empire. He had built his life on order, on patience, on control. But even he couldn't control time. One night, in the quiet of his home, he fell asleep in his chair. The candle beside him burned down to the wick, flickered once, and went out. He didn't wake again. When word of his death spread in 1974, there was no fanfare. No mob procession, no crowds, no flowers piled high. Just a small funeral, attended by a handful of family and old friends. No reporters. No police. Just silence, fitting, inevitable silence. In death, he got what he had always wanted. No attention. No noise. Just peace. On the day they buried him, snow drifted softly over the cemetery. The priest's voice echoed faintly through the cold air, mingling with the wind. As the coffin was lowered, one of his nephews whispered, "He outlasted everyone." And maybe he had. But the truth was simpler. The empire he built was gone, but the method, the lesson of quiet control, would echo through organized crime for decades to come. Silence had been his shield, his sword, and his grave. And as the city of Buffalo sank into another long winter, it seemed for a moment that the snow itself carried his spirit, patient, relentless, and still. Morning came gray over Buffalo. It was March 12, 1974, the kind of day the city barely noticed. Snowflakes drifted through the cold air, melting on contact with the black asphalt. In a small house north of the city, a priest stood over the still body of Stefano Magaddino, whispering the last rites in Italian. The man once feared, once obeyed, once invisible to the law, was now truly at rest. He had died in his sleep, alone, sitting in his armchair. No struggle, no noise, no audience. A quiet ending for a life built on quietness. The news didn't break headlines. A few local papers ran a short column. Stefano Magaddino, 82, Niagara Falls funeral director, dies of natural causes. No mention of the empire, the raids, or the whispered name that had once reached all the way to the FBI's top floors. just funeral director. Even in death, the world obeyed his code of understatement. His funeral was held at St. Joseph's Catholic Church, the same small parish he'd attended every Sunday for half a century. The pews were mostly empty. A handful of relatives sat in the front row. His son Peter, a few old friends, a couple of parishioners who remembered him as the quiet man who always dressed in black. No flowers crowded the altar. No brass bands. No limousines lined the street. The ceremony lasted barely 20 minutes. Then the casket, plain oak, was carried out by 6 pallbearers into a gray drizzle. They took him down the same streets he'd walked for 50 years, past the storefronts, the quiet corners, the faded sign of his old funeral home. The curtains were drawn, the building repainted, but behind those walls had lived an empire. If anyone watching from a window remembered, they said nothing. The procession drove north toward Riverdale Cemetery just outside Niagara Falls. The air smelled faintly of pine and damp earth. In the distance, the low roar of the falls rolled like an eternal sigh, the same sound he'd heard every night from his porch. As they lowered the casket, the priest's voice carried softly in the wind. "Grant him eternal rest, O Lord, and let perpetual light shine upon him." The words rose, then vanished into the mist. There was no applause, no gun salute, just the whisper of snow against the ground. Among the few who attended, some said they felt relief, others an odd emptiness. The man who had ruled in silence had taken the silence with him. Even his enemies couldn't quite hate him anymore. They respected the consistency of his creed. He had lived without spectacle and died without shame. After the funeral, the small group dispersed quickly. By dusk, the graveyard was empty save for one man, a former driver, now old himself, standing by the fresh mound of earth. He placed a single white lily on the grave and muttered, "You never made a sound, boss. Not once." Then he walked away. For weeks afterward, the city carried on as if nothing had happened. No one spoke of Magaddino. The funeral home changed owners. Union leaders, once terrified of his name, now spoke it freely, in the past tense. The FBI quietly closed its active files on Buffalo, marking them resolved by attrition. But in certain corners, old taverns, barbershops, church steps, his name lingered like a ghost. People would say, he wasn't like the others. And they were right. He didn't chase headlines, he didn't crave chaos. He believed that the only real power was the ability to disappear while still being obeyed. Late that spring, an unmarked black car pulled up near his grave. 2 men got out, one from Toronto, one from Rochester. They said nothing, just stood there for a while. Then one of them placed a small envelope at the base of the stone. Inside was a short note written in Italian. L'impero tes ma respira ancora. The empire is silent, but it still breathes. No one ever knew who left it. No one asked. Years later, as the 1970s slipped away, new names would rise in Buffalo's underworld, lesser men chasing louder dreams. But none of them would ever command the same quiet reverence. The silent empire had dissolved, yet its shadow endured, in how business was done, in how voices dropped when certain memories stirred. In time, even the agents who had hunted him came to respect the irony. The man who made secrecy in art had left behind the cleanest record of them all. He had escaped the headlines, the trials, and even the myths. He was, at last, what he had always pretended to be, just another Undertaker in a cold northern city. Night falls early in Buffalo. The air is still, the snow drifts softly over the river. Somewhere, the wind carries a faint sound, not words, not footsteps, just presence. And if you listen long enough, you might hear it, the hum of an empire that once ruled without noise, and the echo of a man who never needed to raise his voice to be remembered. Good night, Undertaker. Good night, Buffalo. Years passed. Buffalo moved on. Factories turned to dust, storefronts emptied, and the streets that once carried whispers of power became quiet for other reasons. The Undertaker was gone, but in the spaces he left behind, the alleys, the basements, the bars near the river, his name still lived, half remembered, half believed. Old men in corner taverns would lower their voices after a few drinks and say, "You know, they say there's still tunnels under the city, built for the booze back in the day. Some say the Undertaker used them to move more than whiskey." The stories varied. Some swore the tunnels ran from the funeral home straight to the docks. Others claimed they stretched beneath the river itself, connecting Buffalo to Canada like a secret vein. Most historians dismissed it as legend, convenient folklore for a town that once thrived on secrecy. But even now, in certain basements near Niagara Street, you can still find bricked-up doorways, sealed tight long before anyone can remember by whom. In the daylight, Buffalo looks ordinary. Snow gathers on rusted railings, church bells echo over frozen roofs, and the river rolls on like it always has. But when fog settles over the city, when the streetlights flicker against the mist, the past feels close again, close enough to touch. People walking home late at night say they sometimes hear it. The low hum of engines beneath the street, or the faint creak of wooden floors in a closed warehouse. They stop, listen, and tell themselves it's just the pipes, the wind, the old bones of the city settling. But a few swear it sounds like something else, like work continuing long after the workers have gone. Buffalo, they say, never really sleeps, just listens. Local folklore began calling it the Silent Empire. Not as a mafia term anymore, but as an idea, a way of explaining Buffalo's strange calm, its quiet resilience. It became part of the city's DNA, a pride in discretion, a suspicion of noise, a belief that true power doesn't need to announce itself. Even young people who had never heard of Magaddino knew the feeling, that sense of something vast humming beneath the surface. For decades, rumors resurfaced every few years. A construction crew digging downtown would find an old tunnel. A diver near the river claimed to see submerged crates. An abandoned hearse was found in a warehouse, tires flat, plates removed, keys still in the ignition. None of it was proven. None of it was disproven. In 1984, a local journalist tried to write a book about Magaddino. He interviewed priests, union men, and retired detectives. Most refused to speak on record. One old police sergeant simply said, "He never left a fingerprint. Not even on history." The journalist gave up halfway through the project. But before shelving his notes, he wrote a final line on the manuscript's last page. In Buffalo, even ghosts know when to keep quiet. That line still circulates on the internet decades later, beneath grainy photos of Magaddino. A black hat, a coat, eyes like frost. To some, he's a villain. To others, a necessary evil. To most, he's just another part of the city's strange, gentle melancholy. Sometimes, tour guides take visitors to the Old West Side, near the blocks where his funeral home once stood. They point to a nondescript building, now a warehouse, and say, "That's where the Undertaker built his empire." And for a moment, even tourists fall silent. There's something about the place, the chill in the air, the echo of footsteps, that still feels watched. Not menacing, just aware. As night falls, the mist from the Niagara drifts inland, wrapping the streets in a veil of white. It's the same mist that once hid smugglers, deals, and secrets. Now it hides only memories. If you stand by the river's edge and listen closely, you can still hear it. The deep, rhythmic pulse of the water against stone, steady, patient, eternal. Some call it the sound of the falls. Others say it's something else. A heartbeat, perhaps, from beneath the city. The echo of a man who once ruled the silence. And maybe that's what legacy really is. Not statues, not headlines, not even names carved into stone. Just the quiet persistence of what you taught the world. For Buffalo, it was this, that there is strength in restraint, and that power, when it lasts, rarely needs to speak. In every quiet deal, every handshake, every unspoken rule that keeps chaos from spilling into the streets, there's a trace of the Undertaker's creed. And though most have forgotten where it came from, the city remembers in its own quiet way. As the wind carries the scent of the river through the empty streets, and church bells mark another hour in a city that outlived its myths, the silence feels not empty but inhabited. By history, by ghosts, by the echo of a man who once believed that quiet was forever. Night comes early in Buffalo. Evening snow drifts softly through the amber light of old street lamps. The river, dark and endless, hums beneath sheets of ice. And somewhere beyond the rooftops, the sound of the wind against the falls carries like a hymn, steady, low, eternal. The city sleeps. But if you listen, you can almost hear what it dreams of. It dreams of men who once ruled without speaking. Of whispers that built empires. Of a funeral parlor that hid an entire world behind its doors. And of a man in black, the Undertaker, who taught the city that true power doesn't shout. It waits. It watches. It endures. In the quiet of the night, Buffalo feels older than its buildings. The neon lights have dimmed, the mills are gone, and the streets are nearly empty. Yet the silence feels full, heavy, alive. It carries something ancient, something that refuses to die. Memory. Somewhere in that memory, Stefano Magaddino still walks. Not as a ghost, not as a legend, but as a rhythm. A slow, deliberate heartbeat that seems to pulse beneath the cobblestones. Each echo a reminder of how much can be built in the spaces between words. People forget the details, the names, the dates, the figures. But what they remember, what always remains, is the feeling. The sense that something vast once lived here just below the noise of the world. a hidden order, a kind of peace, cold and dangerous, but peace nonetheless. That was the paradox of the silent empire. Its violence was invisible, its control invisible, its end invisible. All that remains now is the stillness it left behind. In the decades since, others have tried to rebuild what he made. New bosses, new deals, new promises. None lasted. The era of men like Magaddino belonged to another kind of America. Slower, darker, quieter. When crime was conducted by handshake, when death was a private matter, and when even the most powerful man in the city could walk alone at night without a single camera following him. He would have hated this world of noise, the endless talking, the constant light. He belonged to the dark. Not evil, not heroic, just certain. Certain that silence was stronger than sound, and that a man's word, once given, was more final than a bullet. Now only stories remain. Stories told in bars at closing time, or whispered among old-timers sitting by the river. They point toward the fog and say, "That's where his tunnels were." They laugh, shake their heads, and then fall quiet, as if speaking too loud might wake something that prefers to sleep. And maybe that's fitting. Maybe some histories are meant to be whispered, not written. Maybe some men are meant to be remembered not for what they did, but for how quietly they disappeared. So tonight, as you lie back and close your eyes, imagine the city settling under its white blanket of snow. The river drifts beneath the ice, steady and indifferent. A candle flickers somewhere in an empty church. And in that moment between waking and sleep, you can almost hear it. The undertone of buffalo breathing, the faint echo of footsteps on frozen ground, the hush of a world that once bowed to silence. Power fades, names fade, even fear fades. But silence endures. The snow keeps falling. The wind hums its endless hymn. And the empire that once ruled in whispers finally rests, folded into the same darkness it once commanded. Good night, Buffalo. Good night, Undertaker. May the silence keep you company.